Boy, that looks like fun. It was a good life. I'm Kevin Saunders. I'm a farmer's son. I grew up working hard and playing hard in north central Kansas. I had some champion 4-H calves. My dad was real proud of that. Probably expected me to stay on the farm, but it just wasn't for me. I wanted a different kind of life, and I went off to college to find it. I studied agriculture because it was all I'd done all my life. It just seemed like the thing to do. I was real fortunate to attend college on a football and track scholarship. I really loved sports and the outdoors. After graduation, I went to work as a federal grain inspector in Corpus Christi, Texas, site of some of the biggest grain elevators in the country. That's the life that ended for me shortly after 3 o'clock on the afternoon of April 7, 1981, when something ignited grain dust, causing a series of devastating explosions that blew up the elevator and the adjacent buildings. This is where I was sitting, in a temporary building used as an inspection lab, about 400 feet from the initial explosion. The blast was one of many secondary explosions that blew me right through the roof of this building that's no longer here and slammed my body into that parking lot 300 feet away. After the explosion, I woke up in the hospital in the emergency room with my bed surrounded by doctors. They didn't think I'd live. That scared me. I didn't want to die. I fought hard to live, and I did. But this chair is where I live now. The doctors told me that my back was broken and my spinal cord was severed. They said I would never walk again. At first, I didn't believe them. When I finally accepted the truth, for a long time, I wasn't sure I even wanted to live. They told me I was one of the lucky ones. I wasn't so sure. That moment completely destroyed the kind of life I had come to know. Of course, it destroyed my job and the field I knew. I received a large financial settlement, but along with it came people who wanted that money. I'd gotten some bad investment advice because I trusted the wrong kind of people. And because of it, I lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I lost my wife and my son after the accident. My wife couldn't handle the change and this new way of life. This was a lonely and hopeless time for me. I guess our relationship never was very strong to begin with. And this is just what it took to push it over the edge. I still wonder what my life could have been if this accident hadn't happened.
What caused the explosions that broke Kevin's back, destroyed his ability to earn a living, and took his wife and son out of his life? The same explosions that killed 9 of his co-workers and injured 30 others at Corpus Christi that day? Ultimately, the 1981 explosions in Corpus Christi happened the same way as more than 1,000 other grain dust explosions in the United States this century, and the same way that more than 2,000 explosions have happened around the world where grain is handled, stored, and processed. Grain dust is an incredibly powerful explosive, far more explosive than gasoline or dynamite.
I'm Bobby Meyer. I'm Operations Superintendent at Corpus Christi Public Grain Elevator. And April 7th, 1981, we had an explosion here. I was a grain inspector at that time. If you've gone through it, it's very, very hard to describe unless you've gone through it or unless you've seen it firsthand, the power that a dust explosion has. It's just unbelievable what it does. The blast came through and hit my right leg, blew my shoe off my foot, blew holes in my pants leg. The building that I was in was a portable building. It disappeared. It just blew it away. Blew me over another building. It's probably about 25, 30 foot high. I don't know how far I flew, but just by piecing everything together later, it looks like I flew over the building, kind of catty-cornered, came down, and very luckily on my part, I landed on a chain-link fence on my hips, and that broke my fall, then threw me back on the concrete and cut my head open. I had dislocated shoulder, broken ribs. broken ankle, just bruises and stuff like that.
Any organic dust can explode. Dried milk, sawdust, sugar, flour, spices, starch, and certainly grain dust. There are 7 deadly conditions that are necessary for a grain dust explosion. They are grain dust, the fuel. The dust must be suspended in the air, as in a dust cloud. A certain minimum concentration of the dust must be dry, an ignition source, oxygen, the air, and all of these conditions must be together in a confined space. Let's get rid of some myths about grain dust explosions. Some people believe that plants have to be operating to have a dust explosion. That is a myth. An explosion can happen whether the plant is operating or not. Myth. Dust explosions don't happen in plants constructed of wood. Fact. What your building is made of makes no difference. Dust explosions happen in plants made of wood, steel, or concrete. In fact, wooden structures are more likely to burn down. And when there is a fire in a wooden facility, there is always the potential for dust explosions. Myth. It is only the large grain storage and processing facilities which blow up. Fact. There have been grain dust explosions in plants of all sizes and locations regardless of what materials they processed. Myth. Dust explosions cannot happen if the humidity is high. Fact. It is the humidity content of the dust, not the air, that is important. In fact, there have been dust explosions while it was raining. That means those of you who survived the initial explosions and the rescue workers who come to help you must understand the risks involved as you extinguish fires, remove hazardous material, and search for your friends and neighbors. You are still in danger. Using a cutting torch can cause a fire, or a flash fire can occur when smoldering material inside the bin reaches the outside air and ignites a dust cloud. Don't let your guard down. Grain dust is always deadly. Now, let's create a dust explosion keeping in mind the 7 elements that must be present. Dust simply lying at rest on the floor or on an overhead beam or spout could have 4 of the 7 elements. At this point, it's probably not much of a threat. Even adding an ignition source, another of the 7 elements, does not cause a flash fire or explosion. However, in this simple demonstration, we'll see just how explosive ordinary grain dust can be. First, we have a container of grain dust, just like that on your floor or overhead beams or spouts. The dust is dry. There is an air source that will agitate the dust and put it in suspension, like moving grain on a conveyor or up a leg. This will provide the minimum concentration of dust. Of course, there is oxygen in the air, and a glowing red-hot ignition source like a bearing or metal rubbing against something. We have just created a deadly flash fire. Now we'll repeat the demonstration, but this time we'll confine the space by simply covering the hole with ordinary paper. Now let's demonstrate how a secondary explosion happens using a box with 2 chambers. Now the same explosion again in stop motion. The first chamber has grain dust, air, and an electric spark ignition source in a confined space which creates a primary explosion. The shock wave from the primary explosion travels across the gallery, knocks grain dust from a ledge into the air, and then ignites it with the fireball from the primary explosion. You don't want this to happen where you or your friends work. Grain dust is an incredibly powerful explosive, far more explosive than gasoline or dynamite. A broom is still the most common tool used to remove the fuel, the deadly grain dust, but a vacuum removes even more. You can remove ignition sources with motion sensors, belt alignment sensors, heat sensors, magnets, and other safety equipment.
Fuel and ignition source are the two things we can control in a grain explosion. You can't have it too clean. We believe that we should clean our work areas every day.
There's always dust in an elevator. You just have to stay on top of it and keep up your maintenance program and educate your employees on the proper ways of cleaning and how to keep it clean, and then do it.
It is possible for plants to avoid secondary explosions even where a primary explosion does occur. Clean elevators, free of dust, may have a primary explosion, but they may escape the devastation of secondary explosions. The key is good housekeeping. No, excellent housekeeping, which paid off for this Kansas elevator, which avoided a secondary explosion. Some elevators use edible oil to treat the grain and keep dust down. Well-designed pneumatic dust collection systems in the plant can do the job if they are carefully maintained and equipped with proper monitoring devices to ensure that the system is operating correctly. And if a primary explosion or fire occurs in a bucket elevator located outside of the building, the chances of having a secondary explosion are reduced. How do you recognize a primary explosion? What should you do if you hear one? And how much time do you have to react? We've heard the noise made by a grain dust explosion described lots of ways.
I heard a rumble. I thought we had derailed some cars, and the ground was kind of shaking, and I just kind of piqued my interest, and I really just kind of stopped what I was doing and listened. And then I heard a definite explosion just a matter of seconds later. And when I heard that explosion, I knew the elevator was blowing up.
And once you've heard that sound, you may have only seconds to react. Witnesses say as many as 15 explosions occurred in just 1 minute on the day Kevin Saunders was injured in Corpus Christi.
I always thought that I would have time to run or to do something, and you really have no time. I mean, it's just, once it starts, it goes so fast.
There is a saying that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Over 200 years ago, Count Morozzo described a violent explosion in a flour mill in Turin, Italy. It was more than 100 years later before researchers were able to identify grain dust as a powerful explosive and explain how grain dust explosions occur. We have learned that the best way to protect yourself and the lifestyle you enjoy today is to eliminate one or more of the causes of dust explosions. For example, extinguish cigarettes, lubricate bearings. In a moment, we will ask you to put this tape on pause while you list everything you can think of that might eliminate the possibility of a flash fire, primary grain dust explosion, or secondary grain dust explosions where you work. When you have made out your list, restart the tape. You may want to compare your list with your coworkers and supervisor. And regardless of how many items you have on your list, you know that there are probably more. We already know a lot of ways to make our plants safer. Instead, we react as most humans do. We ignore the unsafe conditions around us, or even make them worse. Why? Because we never expect it to happen to us.
A lot of debris all over the place. I couldn't believe how far the cement would fly, and I couldn't believe how big of a crack. It was just, it's unrealistic. It's just weird.
What am I feeling? I don't know what to say. You always think of these things, you just hope they don't happen to you, I guess.
Employees and their managers at hundreds of elevators, feed mills, corn and rice mills, sugar and starch plants, and other facilities around the country have echoed those words as they stood and helplessly watched their buildings be destroyed and their friends suffer. In 1878, this harmless-looking dust killed 18 and injured dozens when it destroyed 6 flour mills and adjacent buildings in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In 1919, 43 died and 30 were injured when a dust explosion ripped apart a starch plant in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Grain elevators have been the site of dust explosions that killed 235 and injured 921 employees and government workers in the past 35 years. 36 died and 9 were injured at this export terminal near New Orleans in 1977. 5 days later, 18 died and 22 were injured at this grain terminal in Galveston, Texas. And remember that all of those dead or badly injured workers had families or close friends, neighbors, and co-workers, people depending on their economic and emotional support. None of you lives in isolation. Your life and death have impact far beyond yourself. A serious injury would change not only your own life, but the lives of all those around you. And grain dust explosions cause horrible injuries. When this flour mill exploded in Kansas City, one of the 5 injured workers was caught in the direct path of a fireball moving across the roll floor. Burns are among the most devastating injuries that occur in grain dust explosions. Skin, through a series of terribly painful grafts, can sometimes be repaired. But nothing can destroy tendons and ligaments destroyed by burning. Temperatures in the flame front following a grain dust explosion can reach 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit. We already know that grain dust can be far more explosive than gasoline. Dust is also more dangerous than gasoline because gasoline eventually evaporates. But grain dust simply lies there accumulating more and more and more until it is cleaned up by you or an explosion.
Dust is very deadly. I lost 9 very close friends.
It's essential that you attend all your company's safety meetings, and it's vital that you read and understand your emergency plan. Government safety regulations for the workplace are there for your protection. Their purpose is to save your life and the lives of those that work with you. So it's your responsibility to make sure that your plant is in compliance with those regulations and to ensure that all safety devices are in good working order. Here's one last recommendation. Use your senses. Smell. This is the best way to detect combustion before there is visible smoke. Chemical and gas leaks are also obvious to your sense of smell. Sight. Smoke from a fire, sparks, a dust cloud, or accumulations of dust on floors, machinery, spouts, or beams. Use your sense of sight all the time. Sound. Bearings starting to fail. Buckets striking because of a belt misalignment. Foreign material in grinders or conveyors. Flow or lack of flow of materials. Stay alert for any unusual noise. Touch. Overheated bearings or motors. Electrical switches and connections. Wet or overheated grain or ingredients. If it feels hot, fix it. And common sense. Use your training and experience. Sound an alarm in an emergency. Evacuate the building as quickly as possible. Then call the fire department. Grain dust can end it all in a matter of seconds. This dust can be deadly. Treat it with respect.